prologue. Mr. Joseph Maxwell's dark green, bloodshot eyes tracked a snowflake as it drifted past his window and landed upon its ledge. Others followed suit as the bleak sky unleashed its flurry upon Bow Street. The din of passing carriages and pedestrians soon waned in response to the heavy snowfall, until only the occasional whinnying of a horse broke through the hush. At the same time, the distant, muffled voices of Miss Trent, Mr. Snyder and Miss Dexter came from the kitchen downstairs. Reluctant to join them, Joseph lay upon his side on a narrow brass bed in the middle of the room. Located on the first floor of Society's house, directly over the parlour, its interior had been untouched since Thaddeus Dorsey's day. Light green wallpaper, embossed with dark green swirling leaves, had faded in the sun. Patches above the wall-mounted gas lamps had also been blackened by the flames. The exposed floorboards would creak unforgivingly underfoot, whilst their old varnish had been scratched and thinned in several places. A few days had passed since Oliver's arrest. During that time, Mr. Snyder had been kind enough to retrieve Joseph's typewriter and clothes from the house on Duncan Terrace. These, along with some ornaments and prints, had helped him to settle in when he'd first arrived. Yet now he regretted his decision to have them brought to Bow Street. They weren't comforting reminders of home, but instead representations of the happy future Poppy had been denied by him and Oliver. As a result, their presence had only served to heighten his guilt. Attired in an off-white nightshirt beneath the many woolen blankets, Joseph's slender form exuded the strong sense of bodily odour and unwashed linen. His dark auburn hair rested in a tangled mess upon his head, whilst his jaw and high cheekbones were covered in stubble. Having not had anything to eat since the previous day, his stomach complained with a growl. The thought of seeing the others filled him with a dread so nauseating, though, his hunger pains vanished in an instant. It wasn't as if they were unsympathetic, quite the opposite. Yet each expression of condolence, offer of assistance, and gentle embrace had felt like a lie. Those giving them were sincere, of course, but he wasn't sincere in his gratitude. He had spent hours going over what had happened in his mind, and, no matter how he had looked at it, there remained one inescapable truth. He should have done more. It's sickening, Dermot Maxwell sneered. Dragged from his thoughts, Joseph looked at his brother holding the Gaslight Gazette. He'd just finished reading Joseph's article about their mother's suicide and Poppy's murder. How you could bring yourself to write this is beyond me. Joseph eased himself into a sitting position, but remained under the blankets. I had no choice. If I hadn't, Mr. Bolton would have, and he found. It would have been lies. Dermot humphed. At 30, he was the elder by 9 years, but the shorter at only 5 feet 4. Although his wavy black hair and vivid dark green eyes made him handsome, his large nose and pointed jaw were repulsive reminders of their father. His attire consisted of a knee-length black overcoat, waistcoat, suit and tie teamed with a white shirt. All of it, except for the tie, had been tailor-made for him. Unlike Joseph, a hint of lavender soap lingered about him. Dermot folded the newspaper and tossed it onto the writing desk. When are you due to give evidence? In a few days, Joseph mumbled, bowing his head as the nausea returned. You'll need to bathe before then. Dermot glanced over him in disgust. I will. The burgeoning reputation of the Bow Street Society had encouraged the sensationalist press to portray the group as the genius sleuths who had exposed Oliver whilst the police had stumbled around in the dark. As a result, the flames of public outrage had been fanned into a frenzy, thereby compelling the courts to hasten the process. The looming festivities of Christmas had also added an extra degree of pressure. No one wanted to sup their mulled wine between hearings after all. Dermot humphed again and went over to the window. Clasping his hands behind his back and knitting his brow, he gazed out at the horizon. After a few moments had passed, he turned to Joseph. Have you thought about what you will do once it's all over? Joseph lay on his opposite side. I don't know when that will be. Hearing his brother approach, he brought his knees up to his chest and clutched the blankets tightly beneath his chin. But please, I want to be alone. Dermot released a sad sigh, and Joseph felt the bed shift as he sat on its end. As you know, Father has wrote a new will, leaving everything to me. Dermot began in a gentle tone. Both houses on Duncan Terrace, the business, his financial assets, everything. Once he has been found guilty and his inevitable sentence carried out, I intend to liquidise it all and divide it equally between me, you and Fraser. With a sideways glance, he mumbled in disgust. The second Mrs. Oliver Maxwell would also receive a small yearly allowance. I don't want it. Dermot pinched the bridge of his nose. Don't be foolish. It would give you financial independence. He paused as a thought occurred to him. You could finally marry Miss Dexter. No, I couldn't. Joseph frowned and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. Not now. Dermot's lips formed a hard line as he exhaled through his nose. Taking a moment to reassess the situation, he decided a change of tact was required. I've booked passage to New York City in January. I have to close the business there. I want you to come with me. Joseph turned over and stared at him wide-eyed. Me? The change would do you good, and I'd appreciate the company. Joseph sat up. But New York City's in America. It is. You want to sail to America? To be in America? With me? Dermot gave a small chuckle. You're acting as if it would be a disaster. It would be. Dermot smiled. Why ever for? But because it's me. Joseph's eyes became downcast. I always make a mess of things. Taking a firm grip of Joseph's shoulder, Dermot waited for their eyes to meet. Don't worry. I'll look after you. Joseph's eyes became downcast once more. You don't have to decide now. Give it some thought and let me know what you decide once this whole business with Father is finished. Agreed? Agreed, Joseph mumbled, unconvinced. Good. Dermot stood. In the meantime, try to eat and get some rest. Dearest darling Lily, I hope this letter finds you and Percy well. The news in your last was most saddening to your father and me, for it will be the first Christmas Day we have not made merry together. Naturally, we appreciate the pressures of Percy's schedule, and yours, of course, have made it quite impossible. Nevertheless, we are disappointed it will be just the two of us this year. Your father has been utterly morose over it, even if he tries to be strong for my sake. We shall simply have to make arrangements for you both to visit us here in Cheshire come January. Does Percy still perform his delightful card tricks? Dr. Lynette Locke discarded her mother's letter and, plonking her elbows down with a thud, rubbed her forehead with both hands. Closing her eyes at the same time, she reminded herself that her parents knew nothing of what was happening with Percy. Nevertheless, her mother's blatant attempt to make her feel guilty had initially caused her body to tense and quiver from the rush of anger. Plucking the letter from the bureau at which she sat, she scanned the remainder of its contents with dark blue-green eyes blemished by dark circles. A grey tinge had also settled upon her fair complexion, making it look washed out. The rest of her appearance was just as haggard. Her once meticulously styled dark blonde hair was scraped into a tight bun at the back of her head, whilst her bright, fitted clothing had become a loose, dark brown woolen dress. Although only 30, the heaviness of her fatigued limbs made her feel much older. The burden of her husband's round-the-clock care had also caused her shoulders to droop and her posture to slouch, thereby superficially shortening her 6-foot height. She returned to the start of the letter and read, "It will be the first Christmas Day we have not made merry together." Her eyes glazed over as she watched the events of the previous Christmas Day unfold in her mind. Percy had impressed her parents with expensive gifts, charmed them with compliments, and entertained them with his wit and sleight of hand. He had also waited until they retired for the night, and he'd been intimate with her to ask for some heroin. A bitter taste seeped into her mouth as she recalled what he'd said. I only need 1 dose to help me sleep. He'd only ever asked for 1 dose, but it was still 1 dose of many. She lifted her gaze, knowing he was asleep upstairs. It was all he did these days. From the moment his attendant, Claude, had brought him back from the opium den, he'd been undergoing a sodium bromide treatment to help him through the worst of the withdrawals. Outlined in Dr. J.B. Mattison's plan for the treatment of opium addiction, it consisted of administering sodium bromide to Percy every 12 hours. She had started him on the minimum dose of 60 grains in 60 drams of cooled boiled water. Now she was giving him the maximum dose of 120 grains in the same number of drams of water. By the 3rd day of the treatment, Percy had become drowsy. By the fourth, he descended into a profound slumber. Although it had meant he was unaware of his body's fevered reaction to the loss of the opium, it had also caused him to be unaware of other things too, namely the need for him to stay awake long enough to exercise, wash or converse. Even eating had lost all interest for him, and every mealtime had become a battle of wills. When he'd begun to lose weight, she'd had no option but to implement a regime of force feeding. A pained expression fell upon her face as she recalled that morning's breakfast. Percy's struggles were difficult enough to witness, but it was his whimpering after each forced swallow that had truly grieved her. Closing her eyes, she swallowed the lump forming in her throat and took a deep, shuddering breath. Opening her eyes, she took out her writing things and with a trembling hand began her response. Sitting at the table in the Society's kitchen, Miss Dexter planned to draw Miss Trent as she rolled out some pastry for a batch of mince pies. Unfortunately, the more she stared at the blank page, the more her mind was filled with the events of a few days ago. She still couldn't believe it. It was so horrible and yet so tragic. Neither Poppy nor Sybil Maxwell had deserved what had befallen them. Joseph hadn't either. She felt her heart ache. Attired in midnight blue bustle skirts and blouse, the 18-year-old artist's auburn hair was neatly wrapped in a bun at the base of her skull and adorned with plain silver pins. They, and the silver brooch pinned to the collar of her blouse, sparkled in the lamplight. A full decade older than her friend, Miss Trent was also 3 inches taller at 5'7". Her attire consisted of plum bustle skirts with a lilac panel at their front, a plum jacket with silk lapels, a cream blouse with ruffled detailing, and a broad black belt with brass buckle. An apron was also tied around her waist. Like Miss Dexter's, the gold and ivory brooch pinned to her blouse's high neck occasionally caught the lamp's light. Finally, aside from a few loose curls against her back, her chestnut brown hair was pinned atop her head in an elaborately sculpted mass. Setting aside her rolling pin, Miss Trent looked to Miss Dexter with the intention of inquiring after the progress of her sketch. The sight of the artist's green eyes staring unblinkingly through the page at something unseen beneath made her frown, however. It had been hard on them all, but Miss Dexter had taken the news of Oliver's deeds to heart. "Red shirts in the livery," Mr. Snyder's rough East End of London accented voice remarked from the doorway. With a calloused and cracked thumb pointing over his shoulder, his brown beady eyes looked between his friends. Broad in build, his black bushy sideburns and short hair appeared more unkempt than usual. His brown jacket, dark brown trousers, and worn black leather boots were also damp in places. At 48, he was the most senior in the group. "Is it still snowing?" Miss Trent inquired. "Yeah, but not as heavy," Mr. Snyder replied, taking a seat opposite Miss Dexter. "Good." Miss Trent carefully cut circles out of the pastry and scooped a spoonful of filling into the centre of each. "Am I moving too much?" Miss Dexter lifted her head. Realising what she had said, she offered a polite smile. "Not at all." With a melancholic expression, she set down her sketchbook and pencil. "I haven't been able to draw anything." "Inspiration will come, lass," Mr. Snyder gently encouraged. Miss Trent cut out smaller circles from her pastry and, placing them upon her filling, carefully pinched the 2 edges to form a seal. Putting them in the oven to cook, she wiped her hands upon her apron and put some tea things upon the table. "The water should be boiled now," Miss Trent said, as a sound of knocking took her from the room. Miss Dexter stood and, using a towel to grip its handle, lifted the kettle from the stove and poured the boiling water through the tea strainer into the pot. Next, she used a spoon to drive the remaining tea leaves through the strainer before setting it aside and sliding the lid into place. As she returned to her seat and waited for the tea to fully permeate the water, she added sugar and cream to her cup in readiness. Mr. Snyder watched her with concerned eyes. "How have you been holding up, lass?" Miss Dexter stilled part way in returning the sugar bowl. Lifting the lid of the teapot and inspecting its contents, she slowly stirred the dark brew within. "Well, thank you." Mr. Snyder added his own sugar and cream once she had placed the lid and poured the tea. "It's been a terrible business, all this." Miss Dexter hid her sadness with a bowed head as she sipped her tea. "Have you talked to him since—" "No." Miss Dexter simultaneously lifted her head and lowered her cup. She felt her cheeks warm as she realised how rude she must have sounded. "I'm sorry, Sam." She offered a weak smile that failed to reach her eyes. "No, I haven't." Sitting up straight, she arranged her spoon upon the saucer. I think it's best that way. It's incorrigible! A woman suddenly cried from the hallway. Exchanging glances, Mr. Snyder and Miss Dexter rose to their feet. With the latter following, Mr. Snyder opened the door and looked past the stairs to Miss Trent and the middle-class woman in a tall hat, red bustle dress and dark red jacket. For Miss Trent, Mr. Snyder inquired, "Everything okay?" "Yes, thank you, Sam," Miss Trent replied. To the visitor she said, "This is Mr. Snyder and Miss Dexter, members of the Boche Society." Her gaze shifted back to them. "Mrs. Gove is here to ask for the Society's help." "Miss Dexter, could you bring us some tea in the parlour and take my pies from the oven?" "Of course," Miss Dexter replied with a small nod. "Thank you," Miss Trent said. As she indicated the open doorway, Miss Dexter and Mr. Snyder returned to the kitchen. While she removed the pies from the oven and prepared a fresh pot of tea, he gathered up the jug of cream and sugar bowl and put them onto a tray. When she added the teapot to it, he placed a gentle hand upon her arm. "Let me know there's aught I can do." "I will," she smiled. "Thank you, Sam." One. 2 cups, Charlie, Inspector John Conway said, his breath turning to steam in the freezing night air. Lowering the brim of his chubby hat over his tired dark blue eyes, he dropped the coins into Charlie's waiting hand. A 3-foot-high, 3-legged urn with silver finish stood on the far right of the coffee stall's narrow wooden bar. Red-hot coals housed within a grate at its base emitted warmth that, although meagre, was welcomed by Inspector Conway as he held his numb hands over it. Having spent the latter half of the night meeting undercover officers in dank alleyways, he felt every one of his 43 years. Giving a loud sniff, followed by a harsh cough, he winced at the pain shooting through his chest. It had only been a little over a week since he'd fractured his ribs in the Kean Lyons bare-knuckle boxing ring. "Them ribs still?" Charlie inquired, filling the first of 2 earthenware cups with a dark brown liquid from the urn. The coffee, if it could be called that, had been so adulterated with chicory, its intense sweet tobacco smoke aroma was the first he had smelt, followed by a whiff of caffeine. Charlie was similar to Inspector Conway in both age and build. Bundled up in a thick, brown woolen scarf, coat and fingerless gloves, his brown eyes twinkled in the light of a lantern hanging from a hook to his right. The hook being attached to a low set of shelves, similar to a bookcase nailed to a box that served as a driver's seat on the horse-drawn 2-wheeler wagon. "Yeah." Inspector Conway hunched his shoulders, held his elbows against his sides and slipped his hands into the pockets of his knee-length black overcoat. An icy gust of wind blew across his back, causing him to take a step closer to the stall. Pitched beneath a street lamp at the entrance to Westminster Bridge, it was as familiar to the grizzled policeman as his own home. Running perpendicular to the bridge was a low wall made of stone. Beside this was a deserted thoroughfare lined by the buildings of St. Thomas's Hospital. Lamps burned in several of its windows as doctors cared for the sick and dying housed within its walls. On the opposite side of the river, the Houses of Parliament's clock tower chimed 6. The first ship of the day also sounded its horn in the far distance, the reverberation of its deep boom drowned out by the bongs of Big Ben. Inspector Conway preferred to visit the store at this time as he was practically guaranteed to be Charlie's sole customer by the odd doctor. The drunken fast gents and women selling pleasure for a few coins would have come by around midnight, whilst the working men were closer to 3. There was also the strong chance of a cheaper cup of coffee since Charlie, nearing the end of the night's tenure, was keen to sell the last few drops before going home. Pointing to the remnants of meat upon the shelf, Inspector Conway ordered 2 ham sandwiches. In the short time he'd been standing there, the heat from the stall had warmed the reddened cheeks and nose of his weathered face. It had also dried his dark red beard and moustache which had been dampened by the earlier snowfall. Tucking the sandwiches under his arm and picking up the cups, he thanked Charlie and left the stall. Hearing the snow crunch beneath his feet as he went, he took his time and finally put everything down upon the wall's icy top. "Here." Inspector Conway passed a cup to a man in his mid-20s with matted brown hair, a fair complexion blackened by grime, and hazel eyes. Approximately 5 foot 8 inches tall, he wore a green overcoat with frayed edges, tattered brown trousers, a dark blue neckerchief, and a pair of old boots. Gulping down most of the coffee, the man snatched a sandwich as soon as it was offered and devoured it in a few bites. "What have you got for me, Sergeant?" Inspector Conway inquired, taking a bite from his sandwich. He barely noticed the thinness of its meat or the inferior quality of its bread. "It's what we thought, sir." Inspector Conway took a mouthful of coffee. "When?" "Tomorrow, after the shop's been shuttered for the night." "Is their bloke still working there?" The man nodded. "He's going to let him in." "We'll do as we said then." Inspector Conway ate some more of his sandwich. "You'll be nicked with the gang, but don't make it easy for the lads." The man smiled broadly with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Yes, sir." Inspector Conway took a final mouthful of coffee before passing it to his sergeant, who drained both cups in a matter of moments. "Best be off with you." Inspector Conway took back his cups. "Don't want 'em wondering where you've got to." The man wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "They think I've gone to see my old mum. At 6 a.m? I left him last night, sir." Inspector Conway gave a grunt of acknowledgement. Nevertheless, a hint of concern penetrated his otherwise hard gaze. "Watch your doings, lad. I don't want to bury another copper." "No fear of that, sir." The man shook his hand. "Good night." Inspector Conway watched his sergeant hurry away into the darkness. Eating the last of his sandwich, he returned the cups to Charlie and bid him a good night before carefully making his way across Westminster Bridge. Glancing up at the clock tower as he passed, he compared the time to his pocket watch and adjusted the latter. A wind had picked up on this side of the river, prompting Inspector Conway to cross the road and walk in the shelter of the buildings there. His gaze soon fell upon one in particular, the imposing edifice of New Scotland Yard. Standing separately from its neighbours, its many windows shone with lamplight, whilst its 4 turrets gave it the appearance of a castle silhouetted against the night sky. As he neared its main door, a figure emerged from the shadow of the building and held a lantern aloft between them. The moment its light illuminated Inspector Conway's face, though, the constable's dark brown eyes cooled and his lips contorted into a sneer. Lowering the lantern, he muttered a flat "Sir," and returned to his post as Inspector Conway strode past and climbed the stone steps. With a backward glance, he opened the door at the top and went inside. Walking across the hard floor beyond, he heard his footsteps bounce off the whitewashed walls. A gaslit corridor straight ahead was lined by solid wooden doors belonging to the offices of the Metropolitan Police's receiver and pension clerk, amongst others. At this end of the corridor, on the right and left respectively, was a lift and the main stairwell to the upper and lower ground floors. A uniformed attendant stood outside the open doorway of the lift, waiting for a passenger. Inspector Conway's early days of being a detective inspector at A Division had coincided with those of the building. He could vividly recall his first time travelling to the first floor in the lift. His sergeant at the time, who'd held an unerring fascination with new technologies, had persuaded him to give the contraption a try. With them and the attendant, its narrow interior was more cramped than Inspector Conway would have liked. Its concertina gates also had to be dragged across and secured with a loud scraping of metal and clang. Finally, the dragging sensation upon his stomach as the lift moved upward had been far from pleasant. He hadn't travelled in it since. Taking a sharp left and passing under an archway, Inspector Conway entered the second corridor that ran horizontally to the first. Along its right-hand side were windows overlooking a cobbled courtyard. Doors lining its left led to interview rooms and the offices of an assistant commissioner and chief constable. Beyond these was another stairwell leading to the upper and lower ground floors. Passing them all, Inspector Conway took a sharp right into a third corridor that ran vertically to the second and parallel to the first. The doors here led to the sergeant's room, a clerk's office, and Chief Inspector Jones's office. Knowing it was too early for his friend and senior officer to be there, Inspector Conway instead went past his door and into the next, leading to the inspector's room. Inspector George Pilker, a slim man in his mid-40s with a long face, protruding ears and blonde hair, narrow sideburns and thin moustache, was the sole occupant. He looked up from his desk with parted smiling lips as he heard Inspector Conway enter. Yet the moment he saw his face, his smile vanished. Pinching his lips instead as the tightness entered his jaw, Inspector Pilker stood and tidied some papers into a pile. Picking it up, he looked past Inspector Conway as, with a defiant stiffness to his back and shoulders, he walked around him and left. Inspector Conway stayed put until his colleague had passed before removing his hat and, crossing over to his own desk in the far right-hand corner, tossed it onto its top. Easing his overcoat off his shoulders, he winced as the sharp pain shot through his chest. Taking a couple of deep breaths, he nevertheless relieved himself of the garment and draped it over the back of his chair. Intending to stay there for as short a time as possible, he remained standing as he went through the documents which had been thrown onto his desk. These consisted of daily bulletins, handwritten reports from the mob squad detectives, and typed memorandums issued by the chief inspectors. One memorandum caught his eye. It read, "With immediate effect, all Metropolitan Police officers are forbidden from summoning Dr. Percy Weeks to any location for the purposes of seeking his medical assistance. This applies to all cases of homicide, suicide and accidental death, regardless of their location and circumstances. Any officers found to be in breach of this order will be disciplined." Chief Inspector Richard Jones. An intense heat flushed through Inspector Conway's body, causing his face to turn red. Snatching the piece of paper from his desk, his other hand slowly clenched into a fist as he read it through a second time. The thought of Dr. Weeks losing a substantial part of his income only served to heighten his anger further. Crumpling the paper into a tight ball, he tossed it into a nearby bin and kicked his chair into the wall behind his desk.